popular Broadway musical Hamilton has a song that particularly strikes my attention every time I hear it. In the song, the characters talk about when you're gone, who remembers your name, who keeps your flame, and who tells your story. Now this song, other than being an amusing thing to think about, is something that I did not have in mind on an early day in December of 2020 when I was working down in my shop. Now for those of you who are married to Fiach men, and to those of you who know Fiach men, you know that we all have a shop of some sort. I had one, my father had one, his father had two, and both of my sons have shops. Now these are places that we go to work on projects with our tools, and we fix things. That's what we do. And it was my turn to go down into the shop. I was working on a project. I was making a chess table, or attempting to make a high-end chess table for my chess set. And I purchased the perfect thing to do it, a $15 table from the Lion Surplus here in State College. Now I'm going to be honest with you, I do get this shop thing honestly. My father's father also had a shop. That would be my grandfather. Now for those of you who don't believe me, here's pictures. The door on the left is from their shop in Crescent, which actually was a converted church that they turned into a storage area that literally American pickers would have a good time there. You had little trails through there to go see all the stuff. That was their business shop. They did industrial scrap metal, salvage, things like that. But I also have a picture from their home in Crescent, and the arrows pointing to their garage. And in the back of it, I do believe that that was my grandfather's shop. So as Fiachs, we get it honestly, and I'm not going to hide behind that. It's where we go to do the things that we need to do and to fix things in our shops. Now, one of the tools that my father had in his shop in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, was this belt sander that you see here in front of me. Now, my dad had been dead for just over 6.5 years. He died in June of 2014, and his wood shop was something to behold. Not only did it have wood tools, it had mechanical tools. It had a hydraulic, I think 25 or 30 ton press in the back of it. And upon his death, these tools were his legacy. I didn't realize it at the time. I was constantly after him to let me clean it up for him, but I realized that was his scrapbook of his life. Every tool, every hammer had a story. But one of the stories I have was with this belt sander. My dad built all types of things. He built oak tables, he built china cabinets, he built end tables, he built coffee tables out of oak wood, most that he salvaged from barns like Dawn, Alberta in Central City. And he would clean them up, and he would make this wonderful furniture, heavy as all get out. It would take 3 or 4 men to move the furniture around. But at the very end, he would take this tool out, and as a young child, maybe 10 to 14, 10 to 13, I loved to watch him use the belt sander, but he would never let me use it. He always gave me an excuse, Fran, you can't mess with this thing. This is a tool, kind of a little bit like the Christmas story, you'll put your eye out. But now, upon his death, I was able to get this tool, and I thought, okay, Dad, I'm now in my early 60s, 61 to be exact. I think I'm old enough now to use your belt sander to sand the edges of my table. Now I noticed when I took the belt sander out of the box that it was like everything my dad had. It was packed with stuff. Not only was there the belt sander itself, but there must have been 30 or 40 belts that went around this tool to make it function, but they were mostly worn out. Some of them were absolutely stripped. It appeared that some of them he had cut the edges, or cut in half actually, but on the belt sander that I took out was the one that he put on last, and it was the one that would work for me. And believe it or not, I had a pretty good time sanding down the edges of my table until it broke. Well, that's a bummer, I said. I took it off, and I found one of the other belts, mostly smooth, but enough to finish the project, and figuring, well, no problem, I'll just replace these belts when it's over. So I laid it out on the table, And I said, no problem, I'm going to be able to replace this belt. Project finished, I cleaned up, I went out, I sat down on the internet, and I began to look for a belt. Now I measured it with my measure, and it was 2¼ inches wide, but it looked to be somewhere around 20 inches folded in half. How hard is that going to be to find? Let me tell you, it was extremely hard to find. There are no 2¼ by 20-inch belts. And I'm telling you, I looked longer for those belts than I did when I used a tool for the sanding. I could not find that belt anywhere, and I looked and I looked and I looked and I couldn't find it. No problem, I said. That's not going to be a problem. I'm just too dumb to know where to look. So I returned back to the shop. Looking a little closer, I discovered that it was a Skill Model 505 belt sander. Ha! Armed with this information, I'd be able to go back and say, sanding belts for a Skill 505 sander. Back to the internet I went, another hour of my time looking and looking, and I could not find any belts that would fit this sander. But what I did find was a couple interesting things. First of all, they don't make the Skill 505 sander anymore. And in fact, when I looked to see if I could purchase one, the Skill Corporation's either been bought out. I could only find the Skill 505 sander on a site called Vintage Tools. And there they were, about 10 of them, most of them in very poor repair, not like my father's, and the reviews were phenomenal. Heavy sander, does the job, wish they made them this way. Of course, that's all my dad would buy. They did talk about the fact that the power cords tended to break on these, and actually the tool was worth a little bit of money, not enough to retire on certainly, but people were looking for these Skill 505s, and that's where I discovered the fact that they no longer make the belt that fits it. So the only thing you can do is buy a bigger belt and then cut it down, which is exactly why my dad kept all the old belts and why they were there. Well, this Skill 505 now sent me back in, armed with my new information from the internet and armed with the fact that there's probably a very good chance that I'm not going to be able to get the belts for this sander. I returned to the shop and I took a longer look at this device, this vintage tool, and my goodness, I noticed that the power cord was a problem even with my Skill 505 sander. But my father had fixed it like he always did, and that was a black tape around the edge to hold it together. Now notice that the sander was dusty. It was dusty when I took it out. It was clean, but it wasn't brilliantly clean as you would expect. So I continued my inspection of not only the sander, but I started to take everything out of the box to see just exactly what was there. Now, if any of you knew my dad, he never threw anything away. Everything was always good. Everything could always be used. I think that's why the shop in Crescent was just packed to the brim with stuff that someday would be useful and could be fitted. In this belt sander case was an envelope, a brown envelope, and I took it out, and my goodness, look what I found. Here is the box from the Skill, only the end of it, only the part, as you can see, one model 505 belt sander, 2¼ inch belt. So my measurements were correct, 115 volts. Of course, the serial number wasn't there, but I continued to take a look at all the stuff that he had saved in this box. But before I moved away from the box cover, I looked very closely down on the right side. There was a message from my father that he probably had the same problem getting these belts, and he had measured them. They are 2¼ by 21 5/16 exactly in his handwriting on the corner of that box. It started to make me laugh because whenever my father would measure things, his handwriting was impeccable, and you can still read that today. The belts, 2¼ by 21 5/16. Not 21¼ not 21 1/2, not 21 3/8, but 21 5/16. For a Fiat man in the shop, accuracy is everything. I also discovered the book, the instruction manual that came with this, only written in English, no French, no Japanese, no Chinese. And I started to take a longer look at this belt sander that as a child I was unable to play with and use, and as an adult probably never going to be able to use because I can't get belts for it. And I noticed these two orange things at the front of the sander. Well, that's kind of interesting, I thought to myself. I'm going to see what these are, and I went to the instruction manual. Believe it or not, I now understood why this was a vintage belt sander. Those are the two brushes that make the belt sander run electrically. And apparently this was something that would wear out on the Skill 505 belt sander. And here's how you fix it. There was brushes and a commutator, and apparently you would unscrew those little orange caps on the front, and you would replace this to make your sander work better if it started to fail. I didn't even go to the internet to try to look for these. I'm pretty certain if I can't get the belts that I can't get the brushes and or the commutator. But this belt sander that had been with my father and now with me had a fair amount of maintenance that needed to be done with it. Now the instruction manual also advised the owner that you were never to carry the belt sander by the cord, as that it would weaken and it would tear. Kind of made me smile. I guess my father had figured that out too, and apparently everybody that whoever bought one of these Skill 505 reported they were continually replacing the cords. So apparently nobody read the instruction manual, but I did. The other thing that I found interesting on this Skill 505 was a bolt that you see here. This bolt was under the handle, and obviously it had been opened and closed several times. As you can see, the bolt is worn out. Well, this is an unusual bolt, I thought. Once again, I headed back to the instruction manual. I started to laugh again when I realized that this belt sander had a gear case in it that would require lubrication in it. You'd have to add a special type of lubricant, type A, number 6152, and you had to be careful. Too little would cause the gears to rapidly wear out. Too much would be forced out through the seals. I can see my dad was struggling with this. This is why that oil or that gear case cap had so much wear and tear on it. And in fact, inside the box were a pair of seals, apparently, that he had purchased for this high maintenance Skill 505 sander. I have to be honest with you, I didn't read the instruction books until now. And wherever you are, Dad, I'm sorry, I did not check the gear case before I started sanding my table. I hope you'll forgive me. But the more and more I looked at this device, this was a high maintenance product, nothing like we would ever buy today. I thought to myself, my God, how old is this thing? How old can this be? And of course, in typical Fran Fiat fashion, my father had saved the receipt. If you take a look, Keystone Lumber Company, Bellwood, Pennsylvania, you can't call them anymore because I tried dialing Bell phone 2751. Couldn't do it. I see that he paid $57.32 for it, which is just about what a new sander costs today, and eventually I would pay to replace it with a modern one. And the receipt shows that this was purchased August 7th, 1956. Now, I have to be honest with you folks, this is when a bit of tears started falling down my face, and I'm thinking about what was going on in his life of August 1956. If I have my numbers right, my older sister, Mary Jo, was alive by now, born in August of 1955. It had been a year. I'm not quite sure where they were living at the time, or if the home that we owned in Johnstown that contained the shop that he lived in his whole life was under construction. I'm not sure if he knows that my mother Joan is pregnant with his second child, Debbie, yet, but this was an expensive thing to buy. An expensive thing to buy in 1956. This Skill 505 sander, folks, if I have my time right, is almost 65 and ready to retire. This sander is the history of my father, and a story that you never expect to find, and the fact that this was said here, I think, for me to find and share with you all today. My thoughts flooded back to the time of growing up with my dad in his shop, the ever-impressive smell of wood being cut with a saw, the smell of turpentine and sealants that he would use to cover up his projects, the sanding, the sounds, the oldies radio station on a radio that barely had enough noise to hear. I could see the shops both in his basement with a big exhaust fan going. I can remember going up to his shops in Crescent when his mother had left Crescent and cleaning them out. The smell of gear oil. I could smell all of that, and as I took a look at this sander, I laid everything out and took some pictures, and then suddenly things started to dawn on me in a new light. Well, I instantly decided that the Skill 505 sander was not going to be sold or thrown into the trash. I carefully packed everything back into the container that it came in. I took my sweeper though, and I did suck out the 1/4 inch of fine dust on the base of the metal cabinet so that it would fit in and hopefully save the power cord a little bit more. I packed everything back into the Skill packet that my father had left for future people like me, and I even decided that the seals and the bearings that he had purchased for this must needed to remain in here. And I also decided that I would have to throw in carefully all of those Skill sanding belts that were just worn out, couldn't be replaced, that were modified by a carpenter with a young family on his Skill 505 sander, probably the pride and joy of his tool collection when he brought it home, either to Johnstown or I think they were still living with his parents in Crescent while their home was being built in Johnstown. And then I decided this saw, this table, this sander is one of those things that was going to live to tell the story of my father. I just didn't know how to do it because I realized one thing, that this sander had a second story that I needed to tell and leave for those in the future. You see, to most people, it's just a vintage tool. But as I was carefully packing it away, my mind raced and I realized that this is not a tool. This tool tells a story that's been told for generations in the Fiok family, a story of fathers and sons that have come through the years, a story of skills and information, things that make us laugh and things that make us cry. This sander is a connection to that story, and because of that, I had to do something special with it, and I just didn't know what to do. As I continued to carefully package and get everything to fit in there, which is unusual for my dad. He usually had more room for things, but I needed to pack it away carefully so that whatever happened with this, I would know that someday somebody would find it and open it, and perhaps maybe they would look at this Skill 505 sander from 1956 and say, why would Fran ever keep this? Because there was another story that was here that was coming to me at this time. That it's also a story of grandfathers and grandsons. It's a story of those people in our lives that we never realize how important they are to us until we don't have them to talk to anymore. I could hear my dad telling me to keep looking for those, or I could hear him telling me, Jesus Christ, Fran, just get the 3-inch ones and cut them. They'll work and get it done. But I couldn't do that. I know that the fact that this sander still functioned is something that I wanted to maintain. And I also kind of smiled and said, don't worry, I'll store it so that the gear case stays full. It's not a story of just fathers and sons. The Skill represents a story of grandfathers and grandsons. I was thinking about my sons and about my two grandsons. I was thinking about my son's shops, one in Connecticut where a power strip lines up where he charges all his stuff. An outside shed that really he doesn't realize it, but it's just getting as packed as much as my dad's basement in his shed was. My other son in Massachusetts, and I'm thinking about how he's downstairs making things out of wooden logs. He now has a tractor with tire chains. And I'm thinking how that the information has been passed from grandfathers and fathers to the next generation. And then I'm concerned if that information will ever get to my grandsons. Because they're going to need to know, and their spouses someday are going to need to know why a shop is so critical to a person with the last name of Fiat. Now at this time I have two grandsons, Ryan and Grayson. And maybe someday Ryan will see this and, Ryan, buddy, don't worry, I've got you covered too. But I needed to do something with this, something special for my grandson, Grayson. Who's going to tell your story? Who's going to carry your flame? Who's going to tell your story when you're gone? Grayson, you're going to have to carry that story. But I'm going to leave you a very powerful instrument to help you tell the story. So Merry Christmas, Grayson. A gift waits for you from your grandfather. It's a Skipple 505 belt sander. I doubt you're going to be able to find sanding belts for it, and I know you're not going to be able to find brushes or commutators for it. Hopefully by the time you get this, though, you will have an idea of why you need that belt sander. And just maybe someday when you're working in your shop with something, maybe my new belt sander that you can get belt sanders for, you'll take a moment and you'll think back of how you've come this far. Merry Christmas, everybody, from the son of a carpenter.